All right, let's just jump right into this explainer. Today, we're tracing the winding and honestly, surprisingly rebellious political journey of Prince Edward Island to Canadian Confederation. When we think about how Canada was formed, we usually picture this neat, straightforward timeline of colonies just naturally joining hands. But the actual reality for Prince Edward Island, it was anything but simple. What we're really looking at is a story of stubborn independence, deep-seated local grievances, and some seriously high-stakes geopolitical poker.
And that brings us to the ultimate core irony here. Prince Edward Island proudly hosted the very first meeting for Confederation in 1864, the famous Charlottetown Conference. They literally threw the party to discuss uniting the British North American colonies. But when the country of Canada was officially created in 1867, PEI flat out refused to join. They looked at the deal on the table, shook their heads, and just walked away. So how exactly does the literal birthplace of Canada stay out of Canada for 6 whole years?
Well, let's look at part 1, the Confederation holdout.
To really understand why they were so reluctant, we have to look at the highly localized problems the colony was dealing with. They weren't just being difficult for the sake of it. They had deeply rooted issues, and the proposed Confederation just didn't fix them. The biggest one, the land ownership system. Most of the colony's land was owned by absentee British landlords. We're talking about wealthy elites, like the shipping magnate Samuel Cunard, who owned the land while the local residents simply paid rent. Imagine trying to build a life, a community, when you have zero security of tenure, and the people who literally own the ground beneath your feet live an ocean away. Obviously, this caused protracted, bitter disputes between the colonial office, the tenants, and these absentee landlords. And this went on for generations.
Which leads us to part 2, steps towards self-government.
Driven by all that intense frustration with the British landlords and a colonial office that basically wouldn't listen, PEI started carving out its own fierce political identity through some massive democratic reforms. Basically, if London wasn't going to fix their problems, they were going to get the political power to do it themselves, and they gained serious prestige in just a single decade. Check this out. By 1851, they achieved responsible government, meaning power shifted to elected officials. By 1862, their legislative council became an elected body chosen by property owners. Having 2 elected chambers proved they were a totally mature, functioning democracy. And this growing prestige? That is exactly what set the stage for them to host the 1864 Charlottetown Conference. For a small island, they were punching way above their weight class.
But even after hosting that foundational party for Canadian unity, the colony took a really hard look at the fine print. As the historical sources bluntly put it, they simply didn't find the terms of the Union favorable. The proposed Confederation just didn't offer a solid solution to that massive absentee landlord problem we just talked about. So they balked. In 1867, they opted to remain an independent British colony, watching from the sidelines while Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ontario, and Quebec united to form the Dominion of Canada.
Now things get really interesting in part 3, flirting with the United States.
As the 1860s wrapped up, this whole situation turned into a very high-stakes geopolitical poker game. PEI knew they had options, and man, they were not afraid to use them to get the best deal possible. Frustrated by Great Britain and totally unimpressed by Canada's offer, they started weighing 2 radical alternatives. Option A was simple: go it completely alone and remain a discrete dominion unto itself. But option B? This is where it gets crazy. They actually entertained delegations from the United States. The U.S. expressed real, genuine interest in the island joining them. And honestly, PEI's economic ties to the U.S., especially the Boston states, were arguably stronger than their ties to the rest of Canada at that time. They were actively flirting with the Americans just to see what kind of deal they could score.
This brings us to part 4, railways, debts, and union.
So right when it seemed like they might actually go their own way or maybe even become an American state, a massive local infrastructure project completely derailed their trajectory, pun intended. In the early 1870s, the colony decided to modernize by building a railway right across the island. Super ambitious project, right? Well, it went terribly wrong financially. Construction quickly plunged PEI into crippling, overwhelming debt. Almost overnight, this proud, independent colony was staring down the barrel of financial ruin. All that leverage they had, evaporating. They desperately needed a lifeline.
Meanwhile, watching all of this unfold from Ottawa was Canadian Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald, and he saw a golden opportunity. Macdonald was incredibly anxious to thwart U.S. expansionism. There was no way he wanted an American territory sitting right there in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Plus, at the exact same time, he was facing some severe political distraction at home with the unfolding Pacific scandal. He really needed a win. Securing a final union with Prince Edward Island would perfectly complete his vision of an Eastern Canadian dominion.
So, MacDonald sweeps in and offers an absolutely irresistible deal. Let's look at the breakdown. Canada would finally get the last maritime colony, effectively locking the Americans out of the region once and for all. But look at what PEI secured in return. Canada agreed to assume every single cent of the colony's crushing railway debts. And, even more importantly, Canada agreed to finally finance a total buyout of those absentee landlords. The exact issue PEI had been fighting tooth and nail over for decades was finally going to be solved, and it was going to be completely paid for by the Canadian government.
Overwhelmed by that railway debt but completely victorious in securing their long-held localized demands, Prince Edward Island finally surrendered its holdout status. On July 1, 1873, 6 full years after the rest of the country united, PEI officially entered Confederation.
And you know what? The ultimate promise of that union was fulfilled just 2 years later. The passage of the Land Purchase Act in 1875 officially forced the sale of those absentee estates, which finally freed the island from its restrictive leasehold system. The land was actually returned to the people who lived on it and worked it. Today, when we look at modern monuments commemorating this history, like the Confederation Center of the Arts or the massive Confederation Bridge linking the island to the mainland, it really leaves us with a fascinating question to ponder. PEI is celebrated everywhere as the birthplace of Confederation. But considering they balked at the very first offer, openly flirted with the Americans, and stubbornly held out for over half a decade until Ottawa paid off their debts and bought back their land, does that fierce independence actually make them the ultimate shrewdest negotiators in Canadian history? It's definitely something to chew on the next time you look at a map of Canada. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history you think you know.